Ever get that feeling where you hear a story and it just kind of sticks with you? You just can't shake it. You keep thinking about it, the what ifs and all the could have beens. It's just not right. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely those stories that really get under your skin
Hmm.
and make you question
Well,
things.
that's exactly what happened to me when I first heard about Richard Rosario's case.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one. It really makes you think about how our justice system can go so wrong.
It really does. So, for anyone listening who might not be familiar with the case, let's give a little background. Richard Rosario spent 20 years
Hmm.
in prison for a murder he's always said he didn't commit. And get this, from the very beginning, he had 13 alibi witnesses, people who could place him hundreds of miles away from the crime scene.
13 people. That's wild. It's almost unbelievable.
I know, right? It's mind-blowing. So that's what we're going to dive into today. Not just the specifics of Rosario's case, but what it tells us about the bigger picture, about the system itself.
It's a story that raises all sorts of questions about due process, about what it really means to be presumed innocent, about the very foundation of our legal system.
Okay, so let's break this down.
Mm.
Rosario's convicted of murder, but he's got 13 people, 13, saying he couldn't have done it. And yet for 20 years, not a single one of those witnesses was ever contacted by the authorities. How is that even possible?
Well, it's important to remember that this initial investigation happened decades ago, before all the advancements we have now in forensics and investigative techniques.
That's true. But still, to not even try to reach out to a single alibi witness, it just seems like such a massive oversight.
It is. And it really points to how human error and biases and even just simple mistakes can creep into any investigation. I mean, think about it in your own life. Have you ever filled out a form or sent an email or made a phone call that just seemed to disappear into thin air?
Oh yeah, all the time. It's so frustrating.
Now imagine that happening in a situation where someone's life is literally on the line. It's a chilling thought.
It is. And I bet a lot of people listening can relate to that feeling. That feeling of being lost in the system, of being powerless against bureaucracy.
Absolutely. It's that universal experience of feeling like you're banging your head against a wall, like no one's listening. And that's part of what makes Rosario's story so resonant.
So how does this whole thing change? How does Rosario finally start to get some kind of justice?
Well, there's a shift in power at the Bronx District Attorney's Office. A new DA, Darcel Clark, comes in, and one of the first things she does is take a fresh look at some cold cases, including Rosario's.
And she actually decides to investigate those alibi witnesses, right?
Yep. Within weeks of taking office, her team tracks down those witnesses. Some of them had moved, changed their names, all sorts of things. But they all confirm Rosario's story. They place him in another state, hundreds of miles away from the crime scene.
That's incredible. Talk about a turning point. So case closed, right? Rosario's innocent. Everyone goes home happy.
Well, not so fast. It's not quite that simple. This is where the legal side of things gets a little tricky. Clark agrees that Rosario didn't get a fair trial. I mean, obviously with those alibi witnesses never being interviewed. But she orders his release based on lack of due process, not on a declaration of innocence.
So she's basically saying the system messed up, but she's not outright saying he's innocent.
Right. It's a subtle but crucial distinction. And it puts the DA in a really tough spot. On one hand, you want to acknowledge that a terrible injustice was done. On the other hand, you have to be careful about the legal implications of declaring someone fully innocent, especially in a case where the original investigation was so flawed.
I see. So it's not as black and white as it might seem at first glance.
Exactly. There are all these layers of complexity, and that's what makes these kinds of cases so fascinating and so important to talk about.
So let's try to put ourselves in Rosario's shoes. You've spent 20 years behind bars, always maintaining your innocence, and now you're finally free. But there's this asterisk next to your freedom.
Right. Absolutely. He's out of prison, but he's not exonerated. And that's a huge difference, both legally and emotionally. And that leads to another really interesting twist in this whole story. The DA's office offers to dismiss all charges against Rosario.
Which on the surface sounds like a victory, right?
Right. Most people would be thrilled to have the charges dropped. But Rosario, he refuses.
He refuses. Why would he do that? He's already out of prison.
Well, because for Rosario, it's not enough to just be released. He wants his name fully cleared. He wants exoneration, not just dismissal.
So what's the difference? It seems like kind of a technicality.
It might seem that way, but it's a really important distinction. Think of it like this dismissal is basically saying, okay, we don't have enough evidence to convict you right now, so we're dropping the charges. But exoneration is a statement of factual innocence. It's saying you didn't do it.
Oh, I see. So it's like the difference between being found not guilty and having the charges completely erased.
Yeah.
As if they never happened.
Exactly. And for someone who's been wrongfully accused, that distinction matters a lot. It's about restoring their reputation, their dignity. It's about the world acknowledging that they were wronged.
So for Rosario, it's not just about being free. It's about clearing his name completely.
Right. It's about getting that official recognition that he was the victim of a terrible injustice.
Yeah.
And that's a fight that a lot of exonerees face.
Wow. So the charges are eventually dismissed, but the DA never declares Rosario innocent, and they even leave the investigation open.
Which brings up a really important question. What does true justice really look like in a case like this? Is it enough to simply release someone without acknowledging the harm that was done? And what about the need for accountability? If Rosario is innocent, who is responsible for this wrongful conviction?
Yeah.
And what steps are being taken to prevent it from happening again?
These are questions that stay with you long after you hear Rosario's story. They make you think about the limitations of our justice system and the human cost of getting it wrong.
And they highlight the importance of continuing to fight for justice, even when it seems like an uphill battle.
Exactly. So let's dive deeper into that emotional piece. What was it actually like for Rosario to walk out of prison after 20 years? And what were the challenges he faced in trying to rebuild his life?
That's where things get even more interesting. And we'll get into all of that right after this break. You know, it's one thing to talk about the legal technicalities, but it's another thing to actually imagine what Rosario went through when he walked out of those prison doors after 20 years. I mean, can you imagine trying to adjust to life outside after all that time?
It's like being ripped out of time.
Right.
1 minute you're in this tightly controlled environment, and the next you're thrust into a world that's completely moved on without you.
Yeah.
It's got to be incredibly disorienting.
It is. And it's not just that the world has changed, but you've changed too. 20 years, that's a huge chunk of your life. You've missed out on so much technology culture, even just like the way people dress. Everything's different.
It's like when you go back to your hometown after being away for a long time. Everything seems familiar, but also kind of strange. Like you recognize the streets, but the stores are different, the people are older. There's this weird feeling of dislocation.
Exactly. And for Rosario, that feeling is magnified 1,000 times over. It's not just going back to a familiar place. It's like entering a whole new world.
I remember reading about how Rosario would wake up in the middle of the night and almost run out of the house because he was so used to being in a cell where he couldn't just come and go as he pleased.
Yeah. It's mind-blowing to think about all the things we take for granted. Having a key to your own front door, choosing what you want to eat when you go to sleep, who you talk to. These are freedoms that Rosario was deprived of for 2 decades.
And then there's the whole practical side of things. Re-entering the workforce, finding a place to live, managing finances. These are things that are tough for anyone, but for someone who's been incarcerated for so long, it's like starting from scratch.
Absolutely. And then on top of all that, there's the emotional toll. Trying to reconnect with loved ones, rebuilding relationships that were fractured by his absence.
His children were so young when he went to prison. And now they're adults with their own lives, their own families. It's not just picking up where they left off. It's like they have to get to know each other all over again.
It's true. It's like they've all grown and changed in these separate worlds, and now they're trying to find their way back to each other.
I read that his daughter wrote a song about it, about how much she missed him and all the things they couldn't do together. Father-daughter dances, graduations, holidays, all those milestones that he missed out on.
Yeah, those are the moments that really drive home the true cost of wrongful conviction. It's not just about the lost years, it's about all the lost experiences, the missed connections, the ripple effects that extend outward to everyone around the exoneree.
It makes you wonder what kind of support exists for people like Rosario. Are there programs in place to help them reintegrate into society, to deal with the trauma, to make up for all that lost time?
Well, that's a really good question. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the answer is no. There's a huge gap in support services for exonerees. Some states have programs, but they're often underfunded, and there's just not enough awareness of the unique challenges these individuals face.
So they're just released from prison with maybe a couple $100 and a good luck, and that's it.
Pretty much. They're left to navigate this whole new world with very little guidance or support. And they often face huge obstacles, like finding a job with a criminal record on their file or finding affordable housing. It's incredibly difficult.
It sounds like they need more than just a handout. They need a whole support system in place, something that addresses both their practical needs and the emotional and psychological trauma they've endured.
Exactly. They need access to mental health counseling, job training, housing assistance, legal aid. They need help figuring out how to live in a world that's vastly different from the one they left behind.
You know, reading about Rosario's story, it's clear that he loves his family and they love him, But you can also sense that those lost years have left their mark. There's a distance there, a feeling of things unsaid. It must be so hard to rebuild those relationships after everything they've been through.
It is. And then there's the psychological impact of being incarcerated for that long. Imagine the constant fear, the hypervigilance, the feeling of being trapped. Those are coping mechanisms that might help you survive in prison, but they don't exactly translate well to life on the outside.
It's like having a nightmare that you can't wake up from. You know that feeling when you wake up from a bad dream and you're still shaky and disoriented? It's like that, but on a much grander scale. The nightmare was real, and the effects linger long after you've escaped this situation.
That's a perfect analogy, and it highlights the need for trauma-informed care for exonerees. We need to recognize that their experiences have left them with deep wounds that need specific treatment and support.
So we've talked about the personal struggles, the systemic failures, the emotional toll. But what about preventing these wrongful convictions from happening in the first place? What needs to change?
Well, that's where things get even more complex, because it's not just about one bad apple, it's about the whole system. We need to look at every stage of the criminal justice process, from how investigations are conducted, to how trials are run, to how evidence is presented.
It seems overwhelming, honestly. Like, where do you even begin to fix something that's so broken?
It's a huge challenge, but I think the first step is awareness. The more people understand about the issue of wrongful conviction, the more likely they are to demand change. And there are specific reforms that have been shown to be effective.
Like what? Give our listeners something concrete they can hold on to.
Sure. Well, one reform that's gaining traction is the use of double-blind lineup procedures. This means that the officer administering the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is, so they can't accidentally give the witness any subtle cues or biases.
That makes sense. It's like taking the human element out of the equation as much as possible. What else?
Another important reform is requiring the recording of interrogations. This creates a clear record of what happened during the interrogation. And it helps prevent false confessions, which are a surprisingly common factor in wrongful convictions.
You know, we often think of a confession as the ultimate proof of guilt. But if you're under enough pressure, you might confess to anything just to make it stop.
Right. There's a whole psychology behind interrogations and how subtle cues from an interrogator can lead someone to confess to something they didn't do. It's a fascinating but also really disturbing area of study.
Okay, so we've got double-blind lineups and recorded interrogations. What about the role of defense attorneys? I mean, they're supposed to be protecting the rights of the accused.
That's another crucial piece of the puzzle. Unfortunately, public defender offices are often overworked and underfunded, which means that people who can't afford a private attorney may not get adequate legal representation. And that can have a huge impact on the outcome of their case.
It's like going into a boxing match with one hand tied behind your back.
Exactly. Everyone, regardless of their income, should have access to competent legal counsel. It's a basic principle of our justice system, but in reality, it's not always the case.
So it sounds like we're talking about a lot of different changes here. Changes to police procedures, better training for law enforcement, more funding for public defenders, increased awareness among the general public.
It's a multifaceted problem, but it's not hopeless. There are people and organizations out there working hard to address these issues, to advocate for reforms, to support exonerees, to educate the public.
It does give me some hope to know that there are people out there fighting the good fight,
Yeah.
even when it feels like an uphill battle.
Me too. And the more we talk about these issues, the more we raise awareness, the more likely we are to create meaningful change. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about Richard Rosario or any other individual exoneree. It's about the integrity of our justice system and the values we claim to uphold as a society.
So let's go back to Rosario for a minute. We know his conviction was overturned, but the investigation into the murder remained open. Did they ever find the real killer?
That's the big question, isn't it? If Rosario didn't do it, then who did? And, for Rosario, it wasn't just about proving his own innocence. It was also about getting justice for the victim and their family.
Right, because if he didn't do it, then someone else did. And that person needs to be held accountable.
Exactly. And I think for the victim's family, this whole situation must have been incredibly painful. They thought they had closure, and then all of a sudden, everything's thrown back into uncertainty.
It's a tragedy all around.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the need for a justice system that's not only accurate, but also compassionate. One that takes into account the needs of everyone involved.
Absolutely. So to answer your question about whether they ever found the real killer, unfortunately, the answer is no.
Really? So even though Rosario was released and the charges were dismissed, the investigation just went nowhere.
Well, the Bronx DA's office never officially exonerated Rosario. They said the investigation was ongoing, but as far as I know, no one else was ever charged.
So they let him out of prison, but they won't say he didn't do it. That seems kind of strange.
It does, and it really highlights the tension that often exists within the justice system. On the one hand, you have this pressure to solve crimes, to bring closure to victims' families. On the other hand, you have this duty to uphold the law to make sure that innocent people aren't punished.
It makes sense that a prosecutor wouldn't want to admit they made a mistake, especially in a high-profile case like this. But for Rosario, that lack of exoneration must have been really hard to swallow.
Oh, absolutely. He's free, but he's still living under this cloud of suspicion. It's like he can never fully escape what happened.
It really makes you think about what true justice means.
Hmm.
Is it enough to just be released from prison? Or do you need something more than that, like a formal acknowledgement that you were wronged?
That's a question that we all have to wrestle with. I mean, what would we demand if we were in Rosario's shoes? Would we be content with just walking free? Or would we keep fighting to clear our name, even if it meant dredging up painful memories and facing public scrutiny?
Those are tough choices. And I think it speaks to the strength and resilience of people like Rosario, who continue to fight for justice, even when the odds are stacked against them. He could have just walked away and tried to put it all behind him. But he chose to keep speaking out, to use his experience to try to make a difference.
Exactly. And that's what makes his story so powerful. It reminds us that the fight for justice doesn't end when someone is released from prison. It's an ongoing battle, not just for the individual, but for the entire system.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in making sure that our justice system is truly just, that it protects the innocent and holds the guilty accountable.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We can't just assume that the system will always get it right. We have to be engaged. We have to ask questions. We have to demand transparency. And we have to support the people and organizations that are working to make the system better.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Richard Rosario's story, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that wrongful convictions aren't just isolated incidents. They're symptoms of much larger problems within the system. And it's up to all of us to do something about it.
So it's not enough to just feel bad for Rosario or be outraged by what happened. We have to turn that feeling into action.
Exactly. We need to educate ourselves about the issues, support organizations that are fighting for reform, and advocate for change in our own communities. We have to be the voices for the voiceless.
We started this episode by asking what happens after someone is released from prison for a crime they didn't commit. And I think Richard Rosario's story shows us that it's just the beginning of another journey. The fight for justice, for healing, for accountability goes on long after the prison gates swing open.
And it's a fight that we all need to be a part of if we truly believe in a just and equitable society.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Richard Rosario's story. It's been a heavy conversation, but an important one, and we hope it sparked some new thoughts and maybe even inspired some action. We'll be back next week with another thought-provoking deep dive. So be sure to subscribe and tell your friends. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting the good fight.